The second step in figuring out what you're reading is to identify the type of material you're looking at. Just because something is published in an academic journal doesn't mean it's actually scholarly research. And just because something is published by a partisan think tank doesn't mean that you can't cite it as a source. While there are many minor distinctions, the big difference I want you to focus on is between research and opinion. Before I get into detail on this, let me start with a few caveats. First, this is really hard. I'm going to offer some guiding principles, but the line is often blurry, especially since sometimes people offering their opinion present it in a way that looks like what I call research. The second caveat is that this is my opinion. The distinctions I'm about to draw are meant to provide you guidance on what sources you can count as research when you're citing them, for a paper or if you're trying to read them efficiently. Other professors may draw a different line, particularly if they want you to think more about what counts as fact or truth, and how bias enters into how we approach these issues. Finally, I am coming at this from a political science perspective. I'm not talking about other academic or professional disciplines. So what is research? First off, when I'm talking about research, I'm usually talking about empirical, scholarly, or academic research. These three words have different meanings, but generally this type of research is designed to find new, observable information about a question that you don't know the answer to. Before I explain what I mean by that, let me be clear on what I don't mean. When I say empirical research, I don't mean looking up some sources to cite on an essay or support a point. While that is doing research, because you are looking for information, a published piece of empirical research is not the result of a process where you only look for information that supports your opinion. If it helps, we use research as a verb in a bunch of different ways, essentially meaning looking for things. I am talking about research as a noun, the result of a specific way of looking for things. So what is that way of looking for information? Empirical research is typically doing one of two things: gathering original data of any type on an issue, or testing a hypothesis. What these two things share is a clear and explicit or stated process for how the researcher gathered information. When research involves hypothesis testing, it also means the researcher looked for ways their preferred approach could be proven wrong. To get into more detail, let me start with research that generates new data. When I say data, I don't necessarily mean numbers. Data can be any type of information. It can be polling results, interviews, tweets, videos, art or music, historical events, economic indicators, even personal experience or project results. It goes on and on. What characterizes empirical research is that the information being generated is new, it's original, as well as how that information is gathered. The standards on how you gather information vary from type to type, but empirical research always uses specifically stated criteria for collecting it. For example, there are a ton of standards that polling companies use to try and get an accurate representation of public opinion, including random sampling. This means that you ask a group of people that could actually represent the population you're trying to study. Polling counts as research when the authors of a study are very clear about how they selected who they would survey and what they did to make sure that group represented the population they were interested in. This research might be good quality, a true random sample, or it might be biased, underrepresenting Republican voters, for example. But since it is clear about the standards used to evaluate it, it's research. Polling is just entertainment when there is no effort to track or control who answers questions. Most internet polls fall into this category, which is why you get outcomes like Buddy McBoatface. This gets tricky because these standards are different for different types of information gathering. Anthropologists and those who do what's called ethnographic research can't eliminate personal bias from their research because their interactions with the people they study are part of what shape their research. There are, however, still standards on how you record and interpret personal experience and interactions in this context, and you can evaluate the research based on those standards. A report on a development project could be considered research if it's using clear criteria established in advance to do the evaluation. Again, that report might be good or bad. Bad in this case might mean really vague criteria, but there is a standard to judge it. If a report is just reporting anecdotes that justify the initial funding, this is more of a press release than actual research. Hypothesis testing is a little easier to identify and evaluate consistently. This type of research typically has two key elements. First, a testable hypothesis, and second, a methodology, which is a description of how you're actually going to do that testing, how you're going to get an answer to your question. Let me note here that a hypothesis is different from a thesis. I am kind of splitting hairs here, but what you want to focus on is intent. Are you trying to prove something right or test if it is wrong? When you're writing a thesis statement for an analytical essay, you spend the rest of the essay trying to present evidence to prove that statement right. A good justification of a thesis will address alternate explanations for the topic, but only in order to show that they're wrong. By contrast, a hypothesis is a statement that's both testable and falsifiable. That means you have to be able to find and you have to consider information that could prove it true or false. Typically, this type of research is going to demonstrate that there are several theories as to what causes something. Some people think economic development causes democratization, while others think cultural change leads to democracy. Then they're going to present a hypothesis that can test which of these theories is true or false. Just as it is important to have standards for how you gather data, empirical research sets out clear standards for how the researcher is going to prove their hypothesis true or false, and what method they will use to do so. Those methods vary based on the questions and information involved. Part of learning about political science is learning what those standards and methods are. What can be difficult, though, is that journals that generally publish scholarly research don't only publish scholarly research, and they aren't the only organizations to do so. Academic journals also publish book reviews. You can see here, this is listed as peer-reviewed, and it is a peer-reviewed journal, but this is a book review. It's a couple paragraphs explaining what that author said. In addition, there are things called literature reviews. These can be extremely useful to read. They summarize, categorize, and evaluate books and articles, but they aren't original research. They are assessing others' research. In addition, while there is kind of a standard format for empirical research, not every article that is research adheres to that format precisely. For example, not all authors explicitly state their hypothesis, or state it in a way that makes it look different from a thesis statement. For example, in the Posner article on Chiwas and Tumbukas, Posner's hypothesis is essentially that the political salience of the cultural differences between these two groups is different in Zambia than in Malawi because the groups are of different size. This is his hypothesis, but he's not stating it in a way that makes it look like one, in part because this is an older article and the standard is more recent. Oftentimes research today will explicitly pull out a hypothesis like with H1 or say my hypothesis is, so that it's much clearer to the reader. Think tanks and other organizations can also produce empirical research. But it's not the only content they produce, so you need to look at the document to assess what it actually is. Brookings is an example of an organization with experts that produce both research and opinion. This item is a research report. It describes how they gathered opinion data on multilateralism in a post-COVID world and then presents a summary of that data. It's research because it was written with standards in mind that I can use to decide whether I accept its conclusions. Other links here are not empirical research. They provide an expert opinion based on their review of evidence. For example, this is an essay. Technically, it's a book chapter, but it's not academic research. Is opinion bad, then? Not everything that isn't research is opinion, but this tends to be the biggest confusion for students. And none of this is to say that opinion pieces are bad or that you shouldn't read or cite them. In fact, we use them all the time in academia. When academics have opinions, we just usually call them theories. Obviously, these are really big and well-justified opinions. What's important is that you assess a theory or opinion piece differently than you evaluate empirical research. Academic theories have lots of purposes, including clarifying or shaping debate on an issue or presenting new perspectives on that issue. The academic standard for assessing theory is its logical consistency, as well as whether you test that theory on different evidence than you built it on. For example, Chapter 3 in Why Nations Fail describes the first part of their theory that prosperity depends on a country's political institutions. They set up their argument by discussing the differences between North and South Korea. We can decide how convincing we find their argument based on their description of those cases, But if we wanted to do empirical research to test whether it's right, we would need to test it on other countries. What separates opinion, or in this case theory, from empirical research is not whether they present facts to support it. They both do. But it's how those facts are presented. It's relatively easy to find evidence that supports a specific argument. But empirical research is valuable because it can force you to actually look at whether that argument holds up under different conditions. When you assess other opinion pieces, what we might call analysis, or the types of content we read in foreign affairs, for example, you want to consider who is writing the piece, what you think their agenda might be, the logic of the argument, as well as the evidence they present for it. You can always check who the authors are by looking at their bios. You then can consider whether you should care about this particular person's opinion, as well as how convincing you find the actual argument. You don't have the same type of specific standards that we look for in empirical research, but you are still being thoughtful in how you consider the validity of that argument. I want to end by commenting briefly on two common shorthands you can sometimes use to distinguish research from opinion. Research is often longer than opinion and cites sources, but these are what we call necessary but not sufficient conditions. Research needs to cite sources, but not everything that cites sources is research. So this video was actually supposed to be about how to read things faster. It ended up being a very long way to say that if you read empirical research in a certain way, you can read it more efficiently. The next video goes through how to do this in detail. Other types of readings don't really have a consistent format, so it's harder to offer consistent advice. Some opinion pieces offer summaries in the first page or paragraph and can be skimmed by reading the first sentence of each paragraph and going into detail on the paragraphs that have key evidence. Other things are written more anecdotally, which can make them more fun to read but less easy to skim. What I hope this has been helpful in doing, though, is taking the first step in that process, and that is figuring out what you're looking at in the first place.